Welcome to the latest episode of Authors in Conversation with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. I'm delighted that I'm joined today by Chris Blackhurst, who's the author of Too Big to Jail, Inside HSBC, the Mexican Drug Cartels and the Greatest Banking Scandal of the Century. Chris, welcome.
Hi.
So
Hi.
I just want to begin really by saying this is an extraordinary story, but arguably it's had a bit less attention than some other banking scandals, or less attention that it merits. Well, until your book.
Yeah, it's very strange. I was actually in that period. I was city editor of the Evening Standard, and I remember it. I remember HSBC were fined, actually fined the largest amount in American history, $1.9 billion, for enabling or facilitating money laundering for the Sinaloa cartel, which was run by El Chapo. And but you're right, it was a story that it never took off. At the end of the book, I talk about the fact that there was no government, no official inquiry here at all. HSBC is a British bank. It's headquartered in Canary Wharf. Most of the action in the book, or if that's the right word, involves the Americans, the CIA, the DEA, who were moving against HSBC, and that's what they did. But of course, that was in America, and on this side of the pond, it just didn't take off, and yet it is a more egregious example of banking bad behavior, arguably, than 2008.
Mm. So what prompted you to tell the story in this new book?
Well, it was really a chance visit. I'd been to see HSBC, and I was with somebody who used to work at the bank. We were literally on the tube on the way back from Canary Wharf, and we were chatting about the bank, and he talked about the whole. He just mentioned Mexico, the whole episode of Mexico, and literally, kid you not, that evening, in an idle moment, I started Googling, as you do, HSBC Mexico, and I discovered, and in a way I knew, but I sort of, it confirmed that nobody had written very much at all about this scandal, and it took off from there. I sent a paragraph to my agent, and here we are.
Mm. Let's go back to the very beginning. Let's go back to the roots of HSBC. Where does it come from as an institution?
Well, HSBC, part of the sort of part of the beauty, if that's the right word, of this story is that of all the major banks, HSBC was the most disciplined. It grew up really in the colonial era, and for a long time, I mean, in Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank actually grew very quickly on the back of the slight irony from what it was found to be doing many years later, on the back of the opium trade. But lots of businesses did in Hong Kong in those days. But it was actually a very disciplined bank, run along almost militaristic lines. I mean, its managers weren't called managers; they were called international officers. They were expected to. They weren't allowed to marry if they were posted overseas. They weren't expected to actually have girlfriends. Or partners. They lived in shared accommodation, which was very much like officers' mess. They were actually called chummeries. And this, I mean, that might sound 19th century, but as recently as the early 1980s, you had to ask the chairman of HSBC for permission to marry, which is quite extraordinary, really. And its nickname in the city was Honkers and Shankers. And that's how it was seen. It was seen as this, in some ways, a throwback to the imperial era.
Mm. So it's got these kind of colonial roots and a value system.
Yeah,
What is that?
I mean, this would appeal to you as a Scot. It was founded. I mean, it's founded by a Scotsman, Thomas Sutherland, and it 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 makes a case always of being founded. It uses this phrase, um, Scottish banking principles. Quite what they are, given what happened to Scottish banking a lot later. And you wrote an excellent book about it yourself, Royal Bank of Scotland. I mean, I'm not sure where Scottish banking principles got us, but the idea was, I suppose, that these aren't flash places. They're not meant to be. They are very solid, very virtuous. You only borrow what you can afford, etc., etc. Those are, I guess, the sound Scottish banking principles, and you don't over exceed, and that's how it was run for a very long time, for well over 100 years.
And but do you think that is really ultimately a bit of a kind of a myth or a fraud? In that, I wonder, and when I wrote about the Royal Bank of Scotland, I mean, I did, an account of that, as you describe it, sort of Scottish banking principles. I wonder if it also was a bit of a cover for a certain kind of raciness as well.
Yeah,
they were prepared. It was a nice cover story.
Yes, it is. It is a cover story, and what actually happened with HSBC was that they may have had these sound Scottish principles, but they grew and grew, and expanded at a rate of knots. I mean, they grew in fits and starts through the 20th century, but they carried on growing and getting bigger and bigger. And I mean, I just said that one of the ideas was you weren't particularly flash. Well, HSBC built all around the world these huge tower blocks. I think in every major city in the world there's an HSBC tower, which, to my untutored eye, look pretty flash. But they sort of clung to this belief that it was part of their sales pitch, really, that they were, and of course it was a very good contrast, and this is true of, I think, Royal Bank of Scotland as well, that it was a very good contrast against the American banks, which were seen as very aggressive, very expansive, very gung-ho. And, if you're a corporate customer or or private customer, which one would you keep your money with? Well, which is safer? So they made a big play on safe. But it was really, in the end, it became more of a marketing ploy.
Yeah. And that question of reliability, or fostering a notion of trust that you can guarantee that, well, unlike some American banks, you can guarantee as the customer, the theory is that the bank is broadly on your side and not looking for an opportunity to stitch you up.
That's right. And I think one of the things that happens with any organization, whether it's HSBC or RBS or anything, but the longer you go on and the more successful you are, the more you start to believe in your own infallibility, in your own, you start to believe your publicity. Whether they, I don't think HSBC bankers were sat down and taught Scottish banking principles and made to recite them, and gradually over time they got forgotten. But of course they were still there as part of their premise.
So where does the Chapo connection come in? How does that enter the story?
What happened was, I'll keep this very simple, was that HSBC in around 2002, 2003, took a decision, and it did take this decision, that it had already been voted the best run bank in the world. Banker magazine had awarded HSBC this accolade. Now, for many people, or many organizations, that would be, wow, that's enough. I mean, my goodness, that's the banking equivalent of 3 Michelin stars. But it wasn't big enough. And they were getting a bit of flack from City, Wall Street, saying, come on, get bigger. And they took this decision that they would become the biggest bank in the world. And they were a bit obsessed with the Americans, with Bank of America and Citi, which were bigger. And in order to become the biggest bank in the world, they started buying things. And one of the things they bought, they weren't in Latin America, and they bought this bank in Mexico called Bital, which actually was the 5th biggest bank. I mean, you know, unless you're in Mexico, you would never have heard of Bital. It was, frankly, even Mexican terms, a small bank. And the point about Bital, or the danger, and this is when the danger signals should have been flashing. First of all, Mexico, and they, you know, Mexico, there was already the drug wars, the drug cartels, incredible, horrible violence going on, a very unstable society, a very corrupt political establishment. That should have been warning enough. But then within that, there was this bank, and it was privately owned, and they were warned. HSBC was specifically told, this bank, I mean, look, this bank doesn't really do rules. I mean, it just doesn't do them. I mean, it has them, but they pay lip service to them. But the Mexican authorities, they took the view that they would let HSBC come in with their, you know, their UK banking and indeed their sound Scottish banking principles, and they would restore order and bring it right. That never happened. And what happened was that this bank, which was primarily based in the north of Mexico, which is the drug country, the drug cartel country, very mountainous, very rugged, very hard to penetrate, and close to the American border. The drug barons, and one in particular, the biggest and arguably the best of them all, if that's the right word, Chapo, they realized that HSBC, suddenly they got this bank in their midst, which wasn't the 5th biggest bank in Mexico, but it was actually one of the biggest banks in the world. And it could take their money and introduce them to all sorts of things, which Bital had never been capable of. And that's really what happened.
So it's essentially, the Mexican authorities assume that the problem is going to be solved because they'll import the Scottish banking culture, and the opposite happens.
Yeah,
it's essentially HSBC that gets polluted or tainted.
Yeah, that's right. That's the Mexicans. I mean, I interviewed a former head of Mexican bank supervision, who said to me that they assumed that HSBC would bring in these famous controls from the City of London. They'd show, they'd introduce their ways, their management culture, blah, blah, blah. And it didn't happen. It didn't happen because the managers in London, their eye was completely off the ball. They were growing the bank at a rate of knots. They were buying and buying and buying. I mean, they bought a consumer lending business in the States called Household, which cost £14 billion. Why is that significant? Because the old HSBC never did consumer short-term lending. It wasn't in that market at all. They added an investment banking operation to try and become, literally, I mean, they said they wanted to be as big as Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs. So all that was going on. And meanwhile, in Mexico, in a faraway place, there were no controls. And I mean, in a way, the analogy I would give, it's the sort of banking equivalent of Heart of Darkness, where you've got this or which obviously became the film Apocalypse Now, where you've got this faraway place in the jungle where there's a colonel who's out of control. That was Bital. That was the old Bital, which became HSBC Mexico.
And as this spirals, no one notices, or because the sums involved are big, well, and it should have been obvious.
Yes, it was obvious. It was obvious to anyone. They sent out people from Mexico City, to the branches to see what was going on, and they reported back horror stories. And those horror stories were that there were people, and this was also seen by the Mexican authorities. They sent observers around, and they saw it with their own eyes. They saw people who, people who were depositing cash, turning up in the bank, and they had specially made boxes that would fit into the teller's window, so they could get more money in, and it could all be done really easily. In one visit, another visit, one person stood at the counter. I mean, heaven knows how long the queue was behind him, but he deposited $933,000 in cash, in 18 bundles of $50,000. Plus, he had some remaining notes, which actually were $33,000, and that was all handed over in there for anyone to see. Several things were going on. One was that the staff, some of them were corrupt, but also a lot of them were terrified. These are the most brutal, thuggish criminal organizations on earth, and they would. One of their tricks would be to go to the counter and hold up a picture of the teller's husband or their children, whatever, and then that was seen, and that was the warning. If you don't take this money, something's going to happen to them. And so there was that. But the volumes were enormous, and people. The other thing as well was that this wasn't. How can I put this? This really was dirty money. When you go to the States, I've always thought, you get a dollar bill sometimes. You think, oh, it's really falling apart. Well, this was like that. This was street money. It was money from sales of drugs right across the United States, and they were grubby notes, but the volumes were talking billions of dollars. And Chapo's problem was that he couldn't go into a bank in America, in the United States, and deposit it there. There are cameras everywhere, and they are very tight on this in the States. So he had to get the dollars back to Mexico. He used the same smuggling lines that he'd used to get the drugs in. So they took the drugs in, the dollars came out. They then took them to HSBC, where they were put into peso accounts, accounts held in pesos. But then HSBC made available their Cayman Islands operation, where they could hold dollar accounts. So they switched from pesos back into dollars. Then after that, they were free to spend their money on anything. And the Americans, the Mexican authorities and the Mexican authorities and the Americans, the DEA, CIA, were very soon aware of what was going on, because the volumes were so big. I mean, this little bank, this bank that was formerly the fifth biggest bank in Mexico, was outstripping every bank in the world with its dollar deposits within the HSBC. I mean, it's just something had to be going on, and it was fairly obvious.
And you describe it in the book as HSBC sort of realizing. There's this dawning realization. When does that happen?
It happened when there were warnings galore and internal warnings. they kept switching their compliance people that didn't help. I mean, it's classic sort of everything that could go wrong went wrong. So they were, while all this was going on, while the money was coming in, being laundered or washed, they were busy changing the personnel all the time in their compliance area, and management was changing, and the management in Mexico kept changing. They kept flying people in, and none of them bothered to learn the language. And this just riled the locals, by the way. And so all that was going on. And then Michael Gagan, who was effectively number 2 in HSBC, he went to Mexico to really do a sort of meet the clients glad-handing exercise. And when he got to Mexico, he was actually met by officials and told in no uncertain terms what was going on. And even then, the reason I say sort of, it didn't really alarm HSBC that much. They still thought they could get on top of it. The moment that they became really worried was when they learned that the Americans were so fed up with what was going on that they were thinking of withdrawing HSBC's bank charter in the United States. And that would have meant effectively HSBC was gone. They would have had no business in the United States. That caused major panic.
Yeah, because that would cause effectively a run on the bank, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and it was very serious. But then there again, what HSBC did, and this is almost from the from the classic playbook of how to get things wrong, their solution, and I think it's the classic part of the thesis of this book is the title's too big to jail, but we like our businesses to be big. We like everything to be big, bigger cars, bigger houses, bigger yachts, bigger business. Somehow big in our society defines success. And their solution to this problem was to go big. So they outsourced it. They hired hundreds of workers. They actually moved people from a credit card operation across to go through all the records. And these people actually weren't interested. I mean, they were not motivated one iota. They were paid. I mean, they just weren't bothered. And this solution never really unfurled. It never happened because they weren't that bothered. No one was. And indeed, what I tell in the book, what happened was that one of these people going through the records was actually a guy who'd previously applied to join the CIA and had been turned down. He then applied to join this new anti-money laundering program being set up by a bank, HSBC. But when he got there, he was so horrified by what he saw that he got back in touch with the people who interviewed him in Langley, the CIA, and said, I've got things to tell you. And he ended up as a whistleblower. And it's an extraordinary story.
Mm. So tell us about there's the whistleblower, but the police get involved and they're closing in 2012. How does that unfold?
Yeah. What happened was in New York, several things happened. They came together. So in New York, there was a classic NYPD cop who I interviewed called Frankie D. Gregorio. And he is straight out of central casting.
He is.
New York police. I mean, he really is.
Yeah.
It's a great guy. His specialization was drug busts, big ones. And they got this guy in Queens in New York. And when they started looking into him, the trail, he was part of the Sinaloa cartel and it went to HSBC. Meanwhile, there was in the mountains of West Virginia, there was an attorney called Bill Eilenfeld, who was, like a lot of American attorneys, very publicly minded and very very keen and very zealous, and he went after a guy on a Medicare fraud, and it was a blatant fraud. I mean, this guy was very unsophisticated, the fraudster. And when they found out how he was laundering his money, which again was in a very simple way, easily spottable, but a lot of money, it went to HSBC. And this actually got this guy thinking. Ihlenfeld started thinking, wow, if HSBC's like this with this bloke, what are they like with others? And he put together a little team, and they started peeling back because they had big drug problems in that part of America, because Chapo had moved into he started off with marijuana, then heroin, coke, but then it got into crystal meth and also opioids. So they had major problems.
Yeah.
And he realized that there was a huge problem with HSBC, that the bank, all the drug deals, all the drug money was going back to HSBC. So you got in New York and Virginia, and then meanwhile you've got the whistleblower, all three. And it ended up in a meeting in Washington with all three together, with the DEA, with the CIA, and they decided that enough was enough. They had heard enough, and they were going to throw the book at HSBC, and that's what happened.
And HSBC, that's the point where they really understand or grasp how serious it is.
Yeah, it happened quite quickly, and so in the summer of 2012, they'd been warned, heavily warned. They decided that the Americans decided they were going to the Department of Justice. Now it became a matter for them. They had the files, and they were going to seek convictions of senior HSBC people. And in fact, Frankie D, he had flown to London, which is quite rare when you think about it for a New York cop. He came to London, he went to Canary Wharf and interviewed the senior people then. He said he couldn't tell me any more because it was subject to grand jury, but you begin to get a flavor of what was going on. So they were going to prosecute. They were very keen to prosecute. And then this is where it twists. This is the twist, which is that the I'm actually giving a spoiler for my own book, but
it's done beautifully in the book.
No,
so it's worth experiencing twice, on video and in the book.
But what happened was that the boss of HSBC had left the bank. So he was Stephen Green, who weirdly was. I mean, I've met Stephen. He professes to be mad keen on ethical capitalism. He's actually an ordained priest, and he gives sermons on Sunday mornings and things. He had left the bank because he'd been hired by Jeremy Haywood, the cabinet secretary, and David Cameron to go into government. And if this sounds a bit familiar, well, it is, because it was exactly that same combination that hired Lex Greensill, the Australian financier. And there was next to no due diligence conducted on Stephen Green. Suffice that he was head of Britain's biggest bank, the biggest bank in Europe, one of the biggest banks in the world, and he was deemed a big success. If they actually asked, say, the Americans what they thought of HSBC, they would have got a very different answer. But they didn't. And he was actually made trade minister. He was given a life peerage, Lord Green, and he was made a trade minister in the Cameron-Osborne government. And this is the twist. George Osborne went into bat for HSBC, he argued two things, really. One was that the Americans were somehow discriminating against the UK bank or a non-American bank. The Americans shot that down and said, this is ridiculous. We'd behave the same way whether it was any bank, regardless, doing this. There was nothing to do with that. But the second argument, which was that if they went against HSBC and sought convictions, they ran the risk of bringing down the bank, and therefore bringing down, I kid you not, the entire global financial system. And that was the Osborne argument. And he took it to Ben Bernanke, who was head of the Federal Reserve, and Tim Geithner, who was the US Treasury Secretary. And it's all in the book. There's this exchanges between them, and the Departments of Justice officials who were watching what was going on the sidelines, they were horrified. They were, I mean, they don't use words like gobsmacked, but they were gobsmacked because they thought they got HSBC Bank to rights for at least the prosecution. I mean, this bank deserves prosecuting. Mm-hmm. But the British government argued, and Osborne was aided by the Financial Services Authority, which was then our watchdog, and they made this argument that they would bring down banking. That it was exactly the same argument that was used in 2008. The idea that banks are too big to fail. You can't allow a bank to fail because everything will crash down. And I covered 2008 day after day for the newspaper. And I remember that, I mean, in the book, I talk about somebody phoning me up and ranting at me because I was not thought to be supportive enough of the government bailout of one of the banks. And this was the argument being used, and it was used again. And except that this time it wasn't just too big to fail, it was now stretched to too big to jail, hence the title. And the Americans were challenged about this. The American Attorney General, called Holder, he was challenged in Congress and in Washington by several. I mean, Elizabeth Warren, the Democrat senator, I mean, she really went for them. And this phrase was used, too big to jail. And that's really where we are. We're now left with these giant organizations that no government, and in a way, I mean, obviously banking is one thing, but there's an argument that says if it was the pharmaceutical company and it had, I don't know, 15% of the world's medicines, would you move to jail its senior people? If it was the world's biggest retailer, or one of the big oil companies, or one of the big software, or Facebook, or whatever. I mean, we're left with this situation where we've got giant corporations that are bigger than some countries, and governments are seemingly powerless to do anything about them.
Do you feel that Osborne, I suppose Osborne's defense would be that he would say that this is happening, well, so soon after the 2008 crisis and the collapse of RBS, rescue of HBOS, and then HSBC is seen as almost a kind of national champion because it's avoided the worst of the financial crisis, comes out the other side of that. You've got this Eurozone crisis, so that they're desperately scrambling to protect something which has hitherto been seen as...
I think that's exactly right. HSBC was a rare example, was a rarity of a major bank that was not hurt by it did not require any form of government bailout in 2008. 4 years later, it's hit with this scandal, and it is the biggest bank. And I think that is the case. I think that you can make a very credible argument as to why HSBC people should not be convicted or prosecuted.
Mm.
I would make 2 points there, and this is in the book. One is, okay, you're not going to prosecute them, you're not going to convict them, but so what do? The Americans decided to fine them. Well, they fined them $1.9 billion, which, wow, that's a huge amount of money. It's actually 5 weeks of their profits. And the way these banks operate is that is then written down as a cost of doing business. It doesn't hurt anyone. Nobody in the bank is really hurt by this. And incidentally, $1.9 billion fine gives you some idea of what was really going on here. I mean, this was not $100 million fine. This was $1.9 billion. So there's that. And then the second point I'd make is we can sit here forever, and politicians can sit here forever, and officials, and we can discuss whether or not somebody should be prosecuted, what will happen, will the bank fail, will Western finance fail? Okay, I get that. But actually, this is a moral thing. It's about right or wrong. A wrong has been committed, and it is a wrong that goes unpunished. And that is forgotten in this argument. So what happened with HSBC was that they're fined $1.9 billion. They enter into what's called a DPA, which is a deferred prosecution agreement, where they admitted everything. I mean, there's 30 odd pages, the admission. They admit everything and they get a DPA. What that means is there's a court appointed monitor who's put in, who has to satisfy themselves that HSBC is cleaning up its act and reforming its ways. Fine. But the point I'd make here, and this was made by Elizabeth Warren, I can't claim it's my own, although I do agree with it, is that you and I, if we do something wrong, we're not given this option. And actually, true. If you think about drug dealers, in the States, if you're caught, in some states in America, if you're caught dealing 3 times, you go to jail for life. And life in the States means life. And you don't get the option of saying, well, can I pay a fine? Can you make sure that somebody checks I'm cleaning up my... No. You're going to jail. That's it, off. And so there's this, it's almost like there's one law for us and one law for them. It was something my father always taught me when I was growing up. And it's true. I never thought it would be quite so true, but it's true. We cannot. I mean, and the other final point on this is that, which is often lost sight of as well, is that this isn't the Americans slapping on a $1.9 billion fine and clean up your act program, which is only just finished, by the way. And I'll say one more thing about that. But it moves from, shall we prosecute? No, we won't. It moves very quickly to becoming a negotiation. And so it's a negotiated settlement. And of course, for a bank and a corporation like HSBC, this is manna from heaven. They are brilliant negotiators. They buy things, they sell things. They are practiced negotiators. So suddenly you've now got Department of Justice officials having to negotiate. Why are they negotiating? Who's in the wrong here? I mean, and my point about the final point about this program was that they're meant to clean up their act, and there's a court-appointed monitor, and it started in 2013, and it lasted 5 years, and then it was extended a year. So 2019, they came out at of the program, out of rehab, as it were. In December 2021, so not that. Oh, sorry.
It's all right. I'll just make a note to edit.
In December 2021, HSBC is fined 91.3 million pounds by the Financial Conduct Authority in London for lax drug laundering and money laundering controls. So here we go again. And, 91 million's not 1.9 billion. 91 million is still a large amount of money. And actually the facts of that case, which are in the book, they are truly horrifying. So you've got this bank that's meant to reform, but it's still carrying on.
And is this happens, you think, really because in the era of globalization, there's this competition for the banks to become bigger, because the belief is if you don't get bigger, I suppose it's what happened to RBS as well in terms of its mentality in the run-up to the crisis. You either eat or get eaten, so you have to have scale to avoid being taken over and your brand potentially being obliterated. And that creates organizations which are just then almost too big to manage, aren't they? They're just on such a vast scale, and the reporting lines are so stretched.
I've spent a large part of my career, probably, I guess you have too, where we have eulogized bigness. We have praised organizations for producing bigger and bigger profits, employing more and more people, buying more and more things, getting bigger. And I hold my own hand up here. Very rarely do we actually think to ourselves, yes, but what does that mean? What does it mean? I mean, I'll give you an example. HSBC, in a matter of, I think it was 2 years, they went from, it might have been a bit slightly longer, they went from 177,000 employees to 330,000. How do you employ 330,000 people? I mean, I'm sure there's a formula somewhere for how many, what's the percentage of them are rogues in any organization? Well, if it's 1 in 10 and 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, let's do the maths. You've got a lot of rogue employees. How do you, HSBC, and this isn't just HSBC, it's all sorts of organizations, they process millions of transactions every day, millions. How do you keep a tab? How do you know what's going on? Unless you have a whistleblower, unless something really does explode, how do you really know what's happening? And that's one thing. The second thing is, in this era of globalization, we've ended up with these giant institutions, corporations, that actually owe no allegiance to anything or anybody. I mean, if you said to not just HSBC, but any of the where's home? Where's home? Where do you think well, they can't really give an answer. And in the book, I talk about my own experience of meeting bankers, senior bankers. One was at Goldman Sachs, the eve of the Scottish referendum. And I was having lunch with him and I said, how do you feel about tomorrow? And he said, Chris, we're Goldman Sachs. We don't care about the Scottish referendum. And, what they cared about was the privatization program in Indonesia or something like that. And that happened repeatedly, where you meet these bankers, senior bankers, but not just bankers. I mean, media, pharmaceuticals, oil, Where is
It was a
hope?
big part of the 2016 effect, wasn't it? Without getting into the arguments about Brexit, but that was a factor, a component, the sense that there was this superclass that lives across borders
Yeah,
and did very very well out of globalization, and actually, as you say, isn't really rooted in place. Though, as I've pointed out many times, when the bill lands, or when the bill lands, it lands with the national taxpayer usually.
yeah.
Or
I mean, that's
customer.
part of the problem. I mean, look, I don't want to. Let's be clear. I'm sure HSBC pays all the taxes that
Yeah.
it's obliged to pay. There's the legal caveat. But nevertheless, a lot of these organisations do everything they can to minimise their tax, um, and they don't really have any. I sometimes think they have more allegiance to Davos than they do to a country. I mean, that they have more allegiance in some ways to each other,
Mm.
because that's the world in which they operate.
You
It's
made it.
flying in its
Yeah.
private jets. They don't experience the the hell of life that we do. Their bosses are.
It's tough.
No, but they do. And I've been to Canary Wharf many times. I've seen the taxis lined up outside the banks. Um, you know, not just HSBC, but the American banks, to take them home in the evening. If they fly anywhere, sometimes they do go on private jets, depending how senior they are. They certainly turn left when they get on the plane. And they stay at the best hotels. They go to the opera, blah, blah, blah. And it's a different world. And,
Mm.
I think I'm right in saying that some of the tech companies now, I mean, they're bigger than
Yeah.
members of the G20.
Yeah. Or they were until the tech crash. But yeah, yeah. I see what you mean. You made a really interesting point there about our responsibility, and as I felt this writing about the RBS disaster in 2008, is that the period that you describe where HSBC is growing very fast is an era of an obsession with 6 monthly or quarterly reporting, and that's analysts and journalists measuring twice or four times a year the bank or an institution on its return on equity. What are its plans for growth? Has it hit its profit targets? How's it going to increase those profits by 10%, 20% the following year? What does it mean to buy? How will it avoid avoid a takeover? That was the drumbeat, and it was the media, our industry, played a big part in that as well, didn't it? The bank
Yeah,
where the CEO didn't have a convincing answer to the question from the good analyst at the AGM, or big shareholder, what are you going to buy next year?
yeah,
Got a thumbs down from other analysts and from journalists sometimes.
yeah. That's exactly right. And the media, which I'm a part of, and I've written about, been writing in and broadcasting in for a long time. We are as guilty. We encourage, possibly unknowingly, but nevertheless, we should wise up to the fact that we are doing it. We encourage short-termism. The investment community, they want to know what the quarterly earning in the next quarter is going to be like. They're not really looking beyond that. Companies are not allowed to slow. They're not allowed to pause. They're not allowed to take breath. If they do, I mean, if you're maybe not at the moment, because we're living in troubled times, but certainly a few years ago, if you just present flat profits, and these are profits, don't forget, we're not talking about losses, but if your profits are flat, i.e. they're the same as last year, that's regarded as a crisis. You're suddenly in crisis. Well, hang on a minute. I've just been making a ton of money. Okay, it wasn't more than that. It's still a ton of money. It's still profit, but that's not good enough. And we do live in this ferociously. I mean, look, I ferociously competitive global world. I turn on the for entertainment more than anything these days. But I turn on the American financial news when when it's the opening bell in New York, and the way they treat forthcoming results, quarterly results, it is literally life and death. It is a crisis, and if you're a chief executive or chairman, this is your yardstick. It's not the employees. It's not your stakeholders. It's not the suppliers. They're secondary. That your main concern is your institutional investors, and and they've got the ability to fire you.
And the CEO's lifespan in position is relatively short, actually. So
and yet they also go to business school. They've all got MBAs and they go to business school. They also follow sport. They're sports mad, a lot of them. Well, which are the most successful football clubs? Not the ones who chop and change their managers every season.
True.
It's the ones who, have longevity. Whether it was Shankly, Bill Shankly, Alex Ferguson.
Yeah.
But these are people who are around a long time, and that should teach us something. Just getting rid of people, chop, 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 doesn't achieve anything.
Yeah. Just what response did you get from HSBC to the book? HSBC today.
Well, I've not. Truthfully, I've not heard anything from HSBC. At the time, they said they were learning the lessons. I took a very firm decision with the publisher, with Macmillan, that I wanted this to be a story. I'm possibly too cynical, but I didn't want it to be held up by spin. And I know what the spin is. The spin is, this happened a long time ago. Well, not that long ago. We've learned the lessons. The people have changed. Blah blah blah. It's the classic response to, and I say this in the book. It's the classic response to whether it's a politician, a prime minister, or a president propounding on some crisis. It's to say, lessons they're always learning lessons.
So just while I've got you, final question. you referenced tough times.
Yeah.
What's your assessment? And you've been around business and the city for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And you've seen a lot of recessions and some spectacular crashes. Where do you think we are, and how worried are you about the current climate?
I am worried. I started to think that Ukraine would be over quite quickly, and that doesn't look as though it's happening. Until Ukraine is over, I don't think there'll be any sort of even beginning a return to normality in energy and food. I'm also very worried about the UK economy. I have been for a long time. Maybe it's the northerner in me, but I know there's an underlying fragility. Ours is a service economy, very heavily based on retail. The high street is the center of our economy and what we do. And I am seriously worried about job losses in those sectors. We do not appear to have got to grips with providing young people with the proper tools to go into the digital world and give employers what they want. I mean, we have a bizarre situation. I've never seen anything like this, where we have, whatever, I think it's 1 million, talking loosely, 1 million unemployed and 1 million job vacancies, but they can't be filled. Now, look, as you know, I'm a Remainer. I didn't agree with Brexit. I thought we were doing something really stupid. I saw the independence argument. I got that. But the independence came at a price, which was a benefit, which was we got to be part of this trading bloc. And now we're not. And I'm very unhappy with this government. I don't think they've moved quickly enough to resolve the, let's call them the Brexit administration issues. Trade with Europe is very slow, very poor, very held up. I don't think they've done enough on all fronts. And I think we're very vulnerable. I think this country in particular is vulnerable. Saying that, if there was a peace tomorrow, there would be a big lift. I've no doubt Ukraine is tracking it down. What I particularly want to see, though, is some big free trade deals. They've not happened. Where's the American deal? It's not happened. And I do wish, I can't imagine Boris with a whip, but I wish people were being whipped and told to get out there and do proper deals, meaningful trade deals. But we seem to be, where I'm worried is, and this is probably too long an answer to your question, but I'm worried that we're going into we're now entering the almost election campaigning platform.
They're in permanent campaign mode.
Permanent campaign mode, lots of gimmicks, lots of distractions, lots of things that make headlines. But when you actually look at, we're in a bizarre situation where there's a measure, a policy, a new initiative, and you look at it and you think, is that going to go to the heart of what is really going on and where the problems are? No, it's not. Why on earth, suddenly we're going to return to imperial measures? That isn't what this economic crisis is about.
No, it seems it's a crisis of a different order, different magnitude.
There we go.
But Chris Blackhurst, thank you very much for joining us today on this episode of Authors in Conversation. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button below. And also, if you go to the site and you want to get my weekly newsletter on politics and all sorts of other interesting things on Reaction, become a subscriber. But Chris Blackhurst, talking about his new book, Too Big to Jail, Inside HSBC, the Mexican Drug Cartels and the Greatest Banking Scandal of the Century. Chris, thank you very much for joining us. And until next time, thank you very much for listening and watching.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.